Good evening. I'm Melissa Tenney, president of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. It is my distinct honor to welcome you to tonight's Visiting Artist Program, one of SAIC's oldest and most prestigious public programs, which hosts a variety of talks by internationally recognized artists, designers, and scholars. This will be a very special evening, and not just because it is the first Visiting Artist Program event of the 2022-23 school year. First and foremost, tonight's special because we're about to hear from renowned cultural practitioner and SAIC alum Walter Hood, whose extraordinary interdisciplinary work synthesizes art, design, and our lived experiences, and the environment, both living and built, into a dynamic practice. It is also a special evening because we welcome Walter tonight as this year's Bill and Stephanie SAIC Distinguished Visiting Professor. A member of the school's Board of Governors and member emerita of our Board of Trustees, Stephanie and her husband Bill are extraordinary friends to the school, having established both the Stephanie and Bill SAIC Professor of Fashion, Body, and Garment, and the Bill and Stephanie SAIC Distinguished Visiting Professor we celebrate tonight. Their generous gift has enabled us to annually bring an internationally renowned artist and designer to partner with SAIC's faculty and teach our students. This amazing program has brought such luminaries as Andrea Zittel, Ann Hamilton, Amanda Williams, fellow alum Chris Ware, and last year Shireen Nishat, among others, to SAIC's classrooms and studios. We are forever grateful for their generosity. Thank you, Stephanie and Bill. In addition to tonight's lecture and some classroom visits this fall, Walter will co-teach a course with Jacqueline Jakunski, the school's Director of Civic Engagement at SAIC's campus in North Lawndale during his visiting professorship. That course, called Stories and Spacemaking, will take place during the spring 2023 semester. Now it is my pleasure to welcome Mary Jane Jacob, professor in the Department of Sculpture, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Mary Jane will rejoin Walter after his presentation to share your questions. To pose a question, please post it in the Q&A box below. You may also click on the CC button below to engage closed captions, which are available throughout the program. With that, I'll hand it over to Mary Jane.
It is a pleasure to introduce Walter Hood, a landscape designer who has been called a placemaker, a peacemaker, a prophet. There are three things that make Walter so good at what he does. First is his desire to make meaningful experiences. But to do so, he has to give himself to the experiences he encounters. He has to take them in keenly and deeply, as John Dewey put forward in defining aesthetic experiences in art and in life. Walter has the ability to find aesthetic experiences in the world and then reflect on them as he brings them forward to us. Second is his ability to care. But this happens because his personal values do not privilege major institutions over small communities, rich over regular folks. Instead, to Walter, social spaces are about social equity. That's what he cares about. Finally is his methodology of looking, really perceiving beyond the familiar and ignored. This way of knowing was first evidenced in his 1997 book, Urban Diaries, which addressed his neighborhood of West Oakland, where he established his studio in 1992, right out of grad school from nearby UC Berkeley. When later Walter completed his MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in 2013, he developed a thesis on cultural art practice in which he identified three paths: the everyday and mundane, the commemorative, and community life ways, which together, he argued, demonstrated that culture is central to design. The last category, community life ways, was the most radical in supplanting the nomenclature of community design and focusing on the way people live in a place as opposed to how designers want people to live in a place. This idea went further in 2020 when he co-wrote Black Landscapes Matter, that draws upon our American history of slavery and segregation. There is a truth to be found in what is visible and invisible in the earth. I believe this is part of what Walter hopes to bring forward in his SAIC professor class here in the spring. Walter is a professor of landscape architecture and environmental design at the University of California, Berkeley. Among his many awards in 2021, he received the Architectural League 2021 President's Medal, a U.S. Artist Grant, was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Letters, while also being Senior Loeb Fellow for Harvard's Graduate School of Design's Loeb Fellowship. The previous year, he was the Diana Bell Morey Visiting Professor at the Yale School of Architecture. And the year before that, in 2019, he won a MacArthur Genius Grant, as well as the Dorothy and Lillian Gish Prize. And now, Walter.
Thank you, Mary Jane, for that wonderful introduction. Tonight, I feel honored to be back at the Art Institute and delivering the SAIC lecture. And I'm really excited to be with you for the year. And to actually get back to having conversations with the students at SAIC, which I really value. I'm going to start my screen here. And again, I'm going to stop sharing because I did the wrong thing again. I'm going to share my screen. My sound is on, and now I'm going to share. So I hope everyone can see my screen. Tonight, what I'd like to sort of discuss is the place where I live and the place where I work, as Mary Jane mentioned, and this is Oakland, California. I've been living in the same and working in the same environment for the last 25 to 30 years, first as a student, and then as a resident, and then as a practitioner. I entitled my lecture tonight, San Pablo Avenue, Are We Here in the Future? This is around the corner from where I live, and as you can kind of see, its bleakness sort of situates the West Oakland neighborhood. But I would imagine across the US, there are countless neighborhoods like this that have been not invested in the last 30 to 40 years. I'd like to start out with an image from 1974. This is Pomodoro's Grand Disco. And this is in my hometown of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I want to start out with this image because as I was writing Black Landscapes Matter, I ran across this image. You can kind of see the people well dressed in those bell bottoms from the 70s. But this was kind of my future as a teenager about to graduate, going to school. I remember when they placed this Pomodoro Grand Disc in the center of town. And in a way, the 70s were about a future. It was about that anything seemed possible. And reading Pomodoro's sort of ideas about this idea that this was something new, that just with a touch of the hand, change could come. It related to the independence of a changing dynamic city, and we thought all was possible. More recently, I'm working in Charlotte now, and I think this was 5 years ago, I was heading to the Pomodoro and I couldn't find it. It's off to the side, but it's been augmented by these 4 pieces. And these 4 pieces are the origin story of Charlotte, North Carolina, unbeknownst to me. And I was taken that I felt like I was in this alien present as I saw these, because on the left, it looks like someone's panning for gold. There are 2 women, one holding a baby up and the other looking out in the future. But I was taken by this African-American with a hammer. And he is metaphoric for the railroad because Charlotte started at the crossroads. I then thought long and hard about these 4 sculptures as I was taking the plane back home. And I had forgotten that North Carolina was part of the Confederacy, that there was slavery in North Carolina, and that this representation kind of blurs that history as if a free man actually built a railroad. But in a way, this is the thesis for the talk tonight, this idea, can we go home? And when you go home, is it still there for some of us? The other idea that I'd like to speak to tonight is this notion of hybrid landscapes. And as Mary Jane posited, we're very interested in, places where people live. And one thing the environmental or ecological historian Richard White from Stanford, he posits that we don't have a name for the conjunctive beauty of how we've made landscapes over time, that there is no origin, that we must move forward. And if we move forward, is it that we have to take into consideration what has already gone before us? And so this notion of erasure is not common in a hybrid landscape. What you're looking at is a view of the San Francisco Bay. As you fly in, you actually see the salt ponds, and the salt ponds have mixed in with the bay. So no one knows if it's natural or not. And within the hybrid, there are 2 ways of thinking about it. One, linguistics, the conscious hybrid. And this creates an ironic double consciousness, a collision between different points of view. There's this dialogical internal struggle that's going, you can't put these pieces together. And I'll give you an example of a conscious hybrid. This would be a plaza park, that we have compound words to relate to spaces in our cities. And what happens is over time, culture changes these things, and you can't fuse them together, but we've actually accepted them. But if we look at our nomenclature and we accept that, then we must change then the way we act and the way we define certain things. A few projects come to mind. One of the first landmark projects of our studio was Macon, Georgia, where we actually created a yard in the middle of a city, of a public street. And this yard was a replacement for the squares because there were no squares in Macon. And along the yard, we actually placed things that normally fall into a yard. And I use the term because they had segregated most of the people of color, Black folk, on this one street, where there was very little investment here. And I wanted to store things in our backyard versus our front yard. And here I cast cotton bales because the cotton bales were actually part of Macon, Georgia's history, where slaves brought cotton to the city and then they deployed them out through the railroad. And over time, people could then see that this was a place where there's this palimpsest that goes back even before slavery to the Aboriginal. And here, back then in mid-90s, we uncovered the Daughters of the Confederacy obelisk, and we actually created a civic space in front of it so people could actually see that there was a Daughters of the Confederacy obelisk. During the George Floyd moment, by this being visible, people now want this piece to be removed. But one must think 20 years before, this was something that we lived with. The next project that highlights this idea of the hybrid is Lafayette Square Park. The square pre-existed from the 19th century, 1840s. You read, there was a very simple early public square. And of course, different uses started to occur in the square. And the city fathers wanted to erase it, so they immediately greened it. They put in grass and they planted trees. And over time, it became a park. The local Women's Auxiliary Club planted more trees and actually placed more park-like elements. And by the mid-90s, it had become a place for homeless people or transients. And from that, we were able to work backwards and reproduce as if the design pieces were never erased, starting with the observatory that was there the first part of the century, all the way to the restrooms and bathrooms. 20 years later, today, the park is still open and it's used by its locals. It's one of the few 2 restrooms in downtown Oakland. And it's also a place in which if you need to find a space, you can easily find it. And during the last couple of years, as we struggled with homelessness, I had to remind the city and remind the neighborhood that in times of crisis, it's these spaces that have actually come to the aid. 1906, all of Golden Gate Park was actually filled with people who basically lost their homes or were homeless in San Francisco after the great earthquake. And actually housing was actually built in the park and people moved the housing back to the city. I wish we had that kind of empathy even today. Or a few blocks away in a traffic median, the city of Oakland welcomes people to use of certain types of space, but then augments and literally plans all of the actions out of the space. Working here, we reminded the city that this was once a slough and it was once a wetland. And through that conversation, we were able to rebuild the space, remove the cars, infiltrate more water to help reduce the flooding, but to also call attention to the highway that's flying overhead. And today, it's probably one of the most loved spaces under the freeway. Every Saturday, there's a market. And as you go and use the space, you're really open to that palimpsest of uses from the ground to the sky. And then back across the bay to San Francisco, working in Golden Gate Park, most people don't know this was the image of San Francisco in the late 19th century. The western end of San Francisco was a giant sand dune. The fathers of the park, McLaren, wanted to build a great park. Frederick Law Olmsted came out and said, this is not a great place to build a park because of the wind. And he suggested moving it further inland. But McLaren and others wanted to develop the city all the way out to its edge. They went to Europe and studied sand dune removal. And over time, they were able to remove the sand dunes and actually build a great park. And within the great park are these various institutions, the De Young Museum being one, which my office had the pleasure of working on with Herzog and Dimon. And here we wanted to basically do simple things of showing the park, museum in the park, to talk about this fiction, the fiction of flora, the fiction of artifice, what's beneath the ground. And so everything from the building to the paving is like a giant set of sand granules that will change over time. So if the hybrid is on one side, and those are those pre-existing landscapes, those are these pre-existing spaces in which the post-colonial were meant to deal with, that we have to have this discussion. It allows us to have this discussion with time and with history. But the conscious hybrid on the other side, it doesn't disrupt anything. It's searching for new words, new images, new objects that we can begin to integrate and create a historical foundation. And we can actually shock and change and challenge, right? Those conscious hybrids, those ones that we become so familiar with, we can disrupt them. And this is the work that I've done mostly working with Mary Jane as we basically worked on my MFA. This was the bio line, which was my thesis, which was part of Learning Modern Again. And this idea of creating something new. So the bio line, in a way, took on the machine sealing of the air ducts and created a new piece. And I remember I was taken by the quote in architecture, in the art magazine, that you didn't know this was art, or was it part of the building? And that's something that we were searching for. Or this idea of the eucalyptus soliloquy, a small installation at the beginning of my practice where, eucalyptus trees are being taken out of the landscape in California because of their fire risk. We had this idea of this cultural landscape that has existed for over 100 years will be gone, it will be missing. And so can we actually begin to sort of think about it differently? And so in Napa and Sonoma County, we created a very simple line in the landscape. And we tied leaves of eucalyptus trees and waited for the prevailing winds to come through. And when the winds come through every afternoon, there is a conversation between the artifice and actual ecology. Or canned spinach, which was one of our installations at the Oakland Museum of California, where downtown, most people aren't awake at 5 in the morning to watch the produce come into town. But we wanted people to understand that the food that they eat daily arrives from the valley before it's canned. So these were a few projects that really helped us, and when I say us, in my studio, begin to kind of think in various ways as we move forward in the public landscape. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about this 1 mile stretch of San Pablo where my studio is placed. Here you see this 1 mile stretch on the left from downtown to the city limits, and then the larger scale, San Pablo runs probably about 15 miles north out into the suburbs. And the red color that you're seeing is an overlay of a red line map. And this is pretty much the industrial or the vulnerable land in the bay. You see the bay to the left. This area would flood. This is where our sewage treatment plant is. This is where all the crap comes downhill. And so one could guess who lives in this neighborhood or who was put in this neighborhood. And over time, looking out, you can begin to see that how, can I say, the leftover ideas of planning. The red here is still the red line area. There's no investments in these zones unless people are removed. And so over time, there has been no larger high density project built here. And the line creates this line of demarcation. As money, capital comes into the city, it's always on the other side of the line. And again, looking through our neighborhood, we can begin to see that at least 70% of the buildings were constructed pre-1970. So there's an older housing stock, but every one of the metrics one goes through, it begins to cater to the lack of investment and the lack of people being able to see a future in this landscape. So as I was invited a couple of years ago to think of a project for the Museum of Modern Art, the exhibition reconstructions, I thought long and hard about bringing my neighborhood to MoMA, New York. And these images, this bleakness, I had a very simple thesis, is that within this neighborhood, we have half a dozen social services, St. Mary's, St. Paul's, all the saints are here, as well as nonprofits for housing. And in a way, their future is the past to keep things the same. And even though they have these great altruistic goals, it's hard for them to see a future if it's always thought that change is not a good thing for the people who live here. And so I asked the question, how can we actually begin to think of a different future? As Ms. Worrell says, there are Black people in the future. When we make that statement, what do we mean by that? Some people were daunted by this phrase that Black people would be in the future. This is a project, Ormsley, that was done in Pittsburgh. And immediately when this was put up, the calls came in, and I think it was immediately taken down. But what does it mean to begin to think over time? And as Mary Jane mentioned a few years ago in 2019, I taught a studio at Yale University on futures. And we use this futures cone to really talk about, how do we get there? And in most cases, when we're working on projects, right, there are these preferable sort of ways of thinking, right? But what's possible, right, over time? We want to know if it works or not, right? Is it probable? Right? Do I have enough money? Can you show me examples where this has been done before? But when you really do think about how we consider the future, one needs to go back and maybe start in a different place to go forward versus beginning today to think about where we could be tomorrow. And so in thinking about this bleak neighborhood, how could I actually begin to imagine it anew? Are there ways in which we can see the old and think about them in a new way? Are there ways in which we can change this dialectic or this semiotic from a landscape where the signs, the symbols around tell you to move quickly, to go away, to don't stop, to drive through? and where we can begin to actually think about investing in a completely different way. I show this image. We were asked, my studio is right here in the corner. This is a new senior housing project that is being proposed. And the architects came to our studio and presented this. And they had art studios and things. And I asked them, did they know that there were artist studios already in the neighborhood? They drew their 1 mile, I think that's a quarter-mile loop, and that's all of their interests. And we made the map on the left. We said, we will only work with you if you value all of these things that we've noted, which are artist Mildred Howard is right across the street. They didn't know it. You know, new artists are tucked in the back of the casket factory. There are art studios that even I don't know about because I haven't done all the investigation, but the new gentry are not interested in those types of things. So immediately we then started to collect information again to help them understand the place. And one of the things that we've always noticed is that why are our streets named after trees, right? I live on Filbert, there's Myrtle Street, and then we have a street, San Pablo, which is St. Paul, and then we have all the saints there. So again, beginning to sort of think of a different way of reading a place where most people don't want to read. Beginning to collect a list of the artists who've worked here, who are here, and beginning to pay homage to the work that has gone on while we're in this place of limbo. And then looking at that rich cultural history, again, which every developer that's developed in this place probably had no understanding that we made Harley Davidson machines here, that motorcycles were here. The East Bay Rats, I always wondered why we had the East Bay Rats, which was a motorcycle club around the corner, and now I understand. They're building on this cultural layer. There was also Berkeley's, which is actually a bottling plant that's in the building that we just purchased in 1937. Or beginning to kind of think about the renovations to local places, the Triangle Park, which was called St. Andrew's Park, that had a fountain. The fountain was moved because certain people was in the neighborhood, but beginning to sort of document many of these elements so that as we begin to think about investment in other ways, that people around us are part of this larger conversation. And then as these new master plans and affordable housing sites come to mind, we have ammunition to begin to argue and advocate for a more meaningful way in which to think about the place in which we live and work. So as the prelude to the MoMA show that I mentioned earlier, in the Boston Globe, they ran a piece, what if American cities were built for Blackness? And what I'm really getting at, the prefix to this, was the preamble to the show. What you're looking at is my installation here. It's called Black Towers, Black Power. And from a lot of the research, I thought to myself, are there other ways in which we could see ourselves in the architecture and in the plan? Purely speculative. The show was written up by a lot of different magazines, but I thought this one in the Boston Globe sort of galvanized what I was trying to do. Said it proposes to do what architecture has always done, but almost never for Black communities, to engender and galvanize cultural identity in the built form. And I asked the question, just what if? And speaking to some of my contemporaries, I asked the question, are there other ways that we might be inspired by architecture? And Amanda Williams, you're Amanda from Chicago, we both have this interest in inventions. And I was particularly interested in these, what I call mundane machines. And all of these machines, these small industrial designs, were invented by Black folk. Everything from the mailbox to the left, there's a corn shucker, an eraser. I love the ice cream scoop, a pencil sharpener, a dirigible. But beginning to sort of find that there is a legacy of design within the culture, one that's uncelebrated. I asked the question, well, what if I made architecture from these pieces? And working through a more laborious process for 1 mile, I married each one of these inventions with one of the 10 points from the Black Panthers. We want land, bread, housing, educate that exposes true nature of our decadent society, freedom for all Black men held in prison, end to police brutality. All Black people are part of military training, a jury of our peers. We want to end the robbery by capitalists. We want decent housing. We want full employment, and we want the power to determine our destiny. So each one of these objects created a cultural context in which I looked to the architecture, these towers that would pop up and rise up in this area of disinvestment, and begin to have a conversation with one another. And in each one, we basically started thinking about those programs, whether it was self-policing, education, art, and how those might begin to get us to see anew something familiar, which is the high rise. As I was working on this, I was reading Black Skyscraper, and this idea that, you know, once you're in the tower looking down, there's this kind of autonomous or homogeneous sort of feel. But when you're in the tower itself, there's a sense of power, there's a sense of pride. And the section actually begins to create different ways in which people live, in which people can be seen in a landscape. And I'd like to play a little bit of a video. I'm going to run through it to give you a little more sense of that. The music is by my nephew, Jay Hood, who wrote the original score.
For our peoples, our setbacks by design, mental injections lethal, respected Bobby Seale, triple salute to Huey, my voice, my tool, it ain't nothing no presses could do to me, limited resources, crippled communities we reside in, but yet they capitalize off a culture which we provide them, nothing's impossible with the practice of unification, powers and numbers, what we could accomplish together is amazing, improper policing and inequalities are the norm, powerful's an understatement, we done weather every storm, I'm the streets of Oakland that felt the march in the Panthers' feet. We dedicated and determined, we won't accept defeat. This here's in memory of all the ones that came and fought before me. Right fist in the air, every day we write our story. 10 towers, Black power, let that thought repeat. It's been too long, we want the whole table, keep your seat.
So these are just sort of quick snippets of each one of the towers. And each one had a narrative to go along with it that related to housing, again, related to actually being in space, right? And occupying something that was rooted in pure Blackness. And at the base of each one, those institutions that sit passively today actually give birth. So in some, we even start with a church and a baptismal. And the names of all of the inventors are actually placed on the buildings themselves. And so as one moves down San Pablo Avenue, there's a completely different understanding of where our future might be and where our past has come from. So what I'd like to do now as part of the talk is to kind of venture into ways in which some past work has dealt with some of these narratives in ways to see a future, but more up for the students who will be working with me in the spring to begin to think about how can art, how can objects in the landscape actually begin to tell these different stories of place, but how people can relate to those specific places. And I start with this wonderful project that working with Mary Jane Jacobs, Ernesto Pujo, Kendra Hamilton, and Frances Whitehead at the Art Institute, we grew rice over a couple of months in Charleston. And this was probably one of the most powerful projects in my imagination that through a cultivation of a very simple industrial landscape, rice, that you could actually recreate a wetland. And within a few months, we actually had herrings and frogs in this courtyard. But this idea that really we can seek, right, to think about where we are. Project we're currently been working on, putting the oaks back in Oakland. Most people, you would think, when they say Oakland, they would think of oak trees, but a lot of people don't think of oak trees when they think of Oakland. So trying to put the oak back into Oakland and to really trying to create, again, a semiotic where we can begin to understand why were the oaks here? The oaks were here because of a giant alluvial plain that actually brought sediment down to the bay. And there are occasions where people in San Francisco could look across the bay and actually see oak trees. Oaks normally don't grow that low to the water. Or in Broad Museum in Los Angeles, a land of fiction, we actually planted a grove of 110-year-old olive trees and then brought in a few stumps to begin to talk about loss in something that will probably live for a couple more hundred years. In a landscape where everything is fictitious and fleeting, this seems like it gives you longing in a place. And then along the street, where there is a tunnel below, there are these ruptures in the sidewalk to talk about what's below, which is nothing. Or an idea that we've been working with over the last decade or so, and this comes out of the federal or the national park system, has a series or an area they call witness trees, where if you work in a federal landscape, you cannot remove trees that have been there for over, I think, 25 years or so because they've witnessed history. And so these projects that we're working on now try to mark certain trees and the trees speak. So in the stainless steel ring, you sit there and the tree tells you what's actually happened in its past. Or in Chicago, as part of the Biennale last year, we actually planted a grove of 16 witness trees. And we asked people to hang little amulets from the tree to tell us what they witnessed during COVID. Or at the International African American Museum, a grove of palms look eastward. So every morning sunrise, a light comes through the trees to speak for this conversation to Africa. Or objects themselves that situate themselves in the environment. Here in West Oakland, a few miles from where I live, we were hired to do a streetscape and in a landscape that was barren. And instead of doing a lot of planting, we took the highway sign that holds the signs that says get off here or Grand Avenue here, and we removed those. And we actually filled the piece in with our heroes because the neighbors wanted their Black heroes over the street. So we have Malcolm, we have Maya Angelou, who lived here when she was a small kid, and we have Barack Obama. This must have been done in 2008, and Martin Luther King. And then related to them, we just took basic infrastructural elements and made them larger. So the bus stops are 50 feet tall. But this notion that the object then fills the spaces and begins to remind us of the bareness of some of these spaces. Or light boxes, thinking of lighting in a different way, lighting that might tell a story of a year, of a time. And these were based on baseball cards. Or catching water in New York, in the Queensboro, at the Curtis 50 Cent Garden. The neighbors were tired of cutting or calling the fire department to get water. And we made these giant pods that actually catch water. And this past year, we installed a solar pump so that we actually have no hands need to touch the pump now and they fill with water. Or at the University of Virginia, this mythical idea of catching shadows, where I was reminded of my grandmother and the flash of the spirit at cemeteries. And for Catherine Foster, a free Black woman whose sight had been exhumed during a construction site, now bears an object that reflects light, but also provides a portal to heaven. Or Three Trees that was at the previous Chicago Biennale. And this was inspired by Obama being in Jefferson and Washington Park and not being recognized as a president. As the trees were being cut down, Chicagoans were blaming, well, not Chicagoans, but the newspaper were blaming the library for cutting down trees. And so collecting that debris and actually putting 3 new trees that reflect Jefferson, Washington, and Obama. And as I mentioned earlier, the hay bales that sit in the middle of the street, these dormant artifacts. Or John Robinson Park in Arlington, Virginia, that most people don't know the story of the first freedmen's village that was created at Arlington Cemetery, which was a Confederate plantation. And the free blocks for the first 20, 25 years during Reconstruction, free blocks were low. So here they moved, the diaspora of African Americans in Arlington moved to a town called Knock. And in the town of Knock, now we have a new space that actually bears witness. And freed is basically the vertical F going up that talks about we were not here for freedom, but we also got our own freedom here through being free. Or using images from our past to begin to make them come forward, where we actually have a different understanding of what might have happened 50 years ago today. Or the buried ships in San Francisco that were used for ballast along the waterfront, to actually bring them forward in today, to talk about the history of the fire department and the earthquake of '89, and creating a new piece that begins to point to what's down below. And while thinking about this story, to also think of those who navigated the waters before with Thule reeds within the Bay Area. Or the geology itself, the ground itself, and being able to understand, if we begin to exhume what's below, how can we begin to sort of think about where we are today? And in Santa Monica, if you've been to Santa Monica, the cliffs along the beach, all the sandstone has been pretty much removed. And the crying rock or the crying stone, St. Monica Tears, is a piece along the sidewalk of 4 by 6 foot pieces of sandstone that have been quarried less than 100 miles away, that actually create a new street front that talks about an edge. And every day at sunset, the rocks cry. Because for the natives here, the crying rock was where their ancestors were pushed over the cliffs. And for St. Monica, it's where the saint came and cried for the inebriated Spanish soldiers. Or in Wilmington, Delaware, Wilmington, Los Angeles, again at the port of LA, just providing inert material so that kids could actually feel real rock, real stone versus the artificiality of the new parks. So in closing, returning to San Pablo Avenue, this is the area where the students will be working with me. And as part of the Black Tower, Black Power, we actually purchased one of the buildings that was part of that exhibition. The building is located on the corner, and one of the towers was placed in the back. And as you can kind of see here, this was what the building looked like prior, which was a kind of vandalized pot store, marijuana store, that pretty much closed everyone out. The lot in the back, we will develop it. And we're thinking about how do we make this into a community center for the community to come in. And within this 1 mile stretch of San Pablo Avenue, it sits perfectly for that gateway into the city, but for us to begin to help the city think about transforming this 1 mile stretch of road. As you can see, the hills, the highways really bifurcate this landscape. We're in the middle of excavating the building, cleaning it out. This was a furniture store, a bottling cap place, and beginning to sort of think about ways in which we can imbue it in a different way. We now have created a set of frames where we're actually curating local artists' work. Lou Watts is the first artist to basically work to be shown along here. There's Lou. And we've actually are pushing against graffiti and pushing against murals, but really thinking about how can we actually bring fine art to an audience that, again, has been, how can I say, marginally only exposed to street art. And as we every week invite the community in for food, we're trying to make changes to this local landscape. Thank you.
Sorry, Walter, that our world of remote doesn't give us a chance to give you a round of applause, as would be.
Did my images freeze? Did they freeze? I saw some things in the chat.
Yeah, well, I think we caught up. We got there. So I wanted to start with a question which was here, and I think that it maybe goes back and forth. But the question of how important is functionality in the question as posed versus intention. I'll just say functionality maybe versus messaging or memory or symbols, metaphors. So how important is function? We're sort of seeing you in multiple places, and we might say that in your initial training, you were in a functional path.
Yeah.
So how does functionality sort of play in here?
Well, it depends on the work, right? I mean, if I'm making work in the studio for myself, primarily, I'm not really thinking about its usefulness in that way. But, you know, in a lot of public projects, clients do think of how does it work, right? Or visually or physically. And so that's really important. But the big thing that we've been pushing against is to not be pedagogical often, to have to explain something to people, right? And again, just finished a
meaning not to be didactic in the story?
Not to be didactic, that there's a written description next to every piece you do, right? Which is something that, you know, we're finding in public art, it's like a big thing that, oh, you need to tell us what it means. And it's really hard to play that game because you lose everything. You lose that ability to be vague, which I think is a good thing.
And vague, I'll say, perhaps meaning open. That
Open.
is that,
Yes.
you know, in that classic way that art was talked about, but not so much anymore. That and maybe this is where that word intention comes from. Our person posing the initial question is that there are things we intend, and then there are things that happen that we didn't intend. Which I think, you know, we've sort of moved away from that notion because it sounds mysterious that the art has its own life and, you know, things appear. But we might say there is this aspect of discovery, both for the maker and for the viewer. And so the didactic is, you know, closes down.
Yeah. I mean, that's why I started with that Pomodoro, right? I mean, because, you know, as a young person, when I saw that, I didn't know what it was. It was just this piece of art. The new piece that you go, you know exactly what it is. And even when you go to the website, they explain everything to you. Woman is for this, the man is for this. And I thought that was a really interesting time, that there was a period where we were open to a future, not knowing, right? And maybe that was just, you know, the 70s, but it just seemed that there was much more of an acceptance for what might come. Now, as I was doing that research, I also thought that there were more Black people in Charlotte at the time when I was growing up. And in actuality, by the 80s, the demographics changed and Charlotte was becoming a Black city, right? And I think a lot of this had to do with people looking around going, we need a new origin story, right? Which is part of a lot of things that are happening in places today.
So, so I might say that increasingly, or to a large degree, in recent years, you've been making work that we would call public art.
Mhm.
That doesn't do something, but is there, and it works in a different way than maybe design was thought to be. How, in your discussion, your, let's say, maybe holistic sense of being a hybrid artist or a hybrid maker,
Yeah.
how important is it that art is an element in that? And has it become more important?
It's become more important because I found that when I'm making art, I can be me. That I could be Walter in all of Walter's, incarnation. But when I'm a designer, there are certain times that I can't be me, and that's reading that landscape. And some people don't want to go where I want to go, if that makes sense. I'm trying to be, again, a little ambiguous, but some people don't want to think about history all the time. Some people don't want to kind of be engaged in a discussion that's not a congruent ending, right? People don't like flux. People don't like things that are unresolved. And so a lot of the times we're asked to do something, and then when you start going in that direction, there's immediately this change in orientation. And I'm working on a few projects now where, I'm just ready to quit, because we were asked to do certain things, and then when you bring them up, they're not palatable to certain groups of people.
So there's let me say, a kind of profound, serious question here. In coming back to the function or the way in which you work out in public space, and that is, have you felt you had to consider at times the role of safety?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And we're not just talking traffic. This question really gets at the unsafe space that streets and America is for people like yourself.
Yeah. Oh yes, you have to carry insurance. At least a couple $1 million. So, we're not void of that. And again, I have a practice. And so the health, safety, and welfare is a big thing that, coming out of the studio, we're responsible for that. But one of the biggest, things in public art, though, immediately you put an idea out there, people go, someone will climb on it. Someone, they will throw everything but the kitchen sink at the work. And if the work kind of makes it way past that, then you're saved. Like the Santa Monica piece with the stone on the sidewalk. I never thought they'd do that, right? Because Santa Monica has a huge transient population. People are sleeping everywhere on the ground. But Metro said, we're doing this project.
But this question, Walter, is also going further in a particular way. That is that, and in recalling, for instance, Tulsa, where Black people had their own spaces, they lived, it seemed, in relative safety and a certain prosperity, and yet were violently attacked. And in this future that you're considering, this is the question asked, perhaps a Black oasis or a Black space. What about the safety of those that you're celebrating and embracing and trying to make space for, where it hasn't existed?
Well, I would say, within this kind of fictitious and speculative Black space, to me, I see them safer because these environments that we live in today are not safe at all, right? I mean, and so in a way, it's on the opposite end of the spectrum in my mind, right? Where people are dying today from neglect and from these other things. I'm looking at that other marriage on the other side where these oases become these places where we actually see ourselves differently. And when we see ourselves differently, then maybe we act differently, right? And since I do think that is, the way, in this neighborhood, the backdrop is everything, right? I mean, if I see 3 young African Americans in this neighborhood, immediately fear comes about because of the backdrop. I take those same 3, put them in Berkeley, I'm waving, right? And again, those prosceniums of really matter. And again, Black power, Black power was really meant to, how do we change the semiotics? Or is it even possible to do that, right? And so those are the questions that we're struggling with.
Have you had any projects where you were seeking that intention, seeking a certain message, and how it was used, how it was thought of, how it was taken in by the public was completely at odds, misconstrued from where you were going with it, misunderstood?
Oh yeah. I'll give you a good example. I didn't show it. It's a project in Princeton. It's called Double Sites. And it was a competition that we won to critique Woodrow Wilson, because the Black students at Princeton wanted his name off the School of Public Policy. When I met with the students, I told them that I was using Du Bois's double consciousness as this way to critique Woodrow Wilson, that he didn't have a conscience, and that this being privileged means that you can think singularly. And the piece was metaphorical. And the students immediately was like, you cannot use Du Bois, you can't. We want his name off. And then the piece got built, it went up, and during Black Homecoming, they decided to open it at Black Homecoming. And it was one of the most crazy openings I've ever had, with people saying, screw that piece, we don't want that piece, we want his name removed. And this is of a younger generation. And within a year, I was having conversations with the students, and I was saying, well, this was a competition, I'm the artist, I understand, and they're like, screw that piece, we don't want it, we don't want it. And during the summer of George Floyd, the trustees went out and took a look at the piece, and they had always voted to keep the name. And after looking at the piece, they actually removed the name. And so in a way, there was this outcry by the local community, which didn't really understand the work that the piece was meant to do, because they were looking at it only as a kind of an aesthetic marker, but the piece actually did work. And since then, the name is gone. So both sides win. But it was one of the first times that I had to deal with a community that looked like me, that basically were like, we don't want that piece, we want this other thing. And it was very intense. And it made me think about, should the piece be permanent? Would I be okay if the piece was removed? It made me it challenged my thinking about permanence in a way. And even today, I think if the piece came down today, it's done its work.
So in a way that activated the community, is there another example where, maybe not in this counter notion of accepting the controversy, but moving toward something that you built and designed where you saw the agency of Black and or white communities sort of emerge by the presence of your work? I mean, we could say that with the Splash Park, we could say that with the park in the center of Oakland and its use, but sort of moving closer in this history and place notion that you've been working with more, where you've really seen it become either an instigator of agency and change, or play within that, within a stream that maybe was already motivated and going?
Well, I mean, the piece at the University of Virginia, I've been taken by how many responses I've had from people. An older white couple came up to me in Philadelphia during a lecture and thanked me. And I was like, for the lecture? They goes, no, thank you for the piece you did at the UVA. You know, it made us see the campus completely different. And I was taken aback by that, because I never expected an elderly white couple, right, to basically have that kind of impact, for it to have that impact on them. The other is the Freed project I showed with the letters. There was a soldier, a retired young African-American Marine, who stood up in the meeting, was like, I fought for freedom. And we had this amazing conversation in a community meeting about the difference between freed and freedom. And again, it was one of those things that I was into, this freedman, freed woman thing, because it's nomenclature. And my client was like, you can't talk to the community about this. And I was like, why not? And it was a wonderful conversation, because it even got down to, you know, whites at the meeting was like, yeah, freed. That's when I left my husband. You know, I mean, it was like this interesting conversation, right, around a word that we normally don't think about, right, in this larger context. And for me, it was always that don't look back, someone's gaining on you, right? That it's always like, I mean, as a Black man, I always feel like someone's going to come and grab me and put me in jail, right? But it's like, how do you talk about that without doing that? And so the piece for me, again, people might look at it today and go, oh, that's just a word, it's a Klaus Hogenberg turned on its side. But in a way, part of the process of making it is actually instilled in the piece as well. And those conversations with people.
So we've been talking about the effects of the work, what you realized, what people shared with you. So there's an interest among the audience to also know, how do you begin your research? Where does it start? And, you know, we would hope, I would expect there's some through line to some of the things which are effects, but yeah. How does it begin? And also the beginning is sometimes commissions and jobs, and sometimes maybe you.
Yeah. Well, it's a hard question to ask, right? Because
I'm sure there's lots of versions, but
I mean, the research starts, you know, with the project, right? I mean, when the project is identified, I'm already thinking, and, you know, if you had asked me this 15 years ago, it would be very different than today. So there is this, I try to work in the studio, projects that have not been born, or projects that have been thrown out and not done. And so there's already this culture here in the studio of a way of thinking. And, you know, we try to use, again, this idea of culture, narrative, stories, you know, fiction, nonfiction. It just depends on where that starting point might be. Like if I'm interested, I'll give you an example. Working in Jackson, Wyoming, I knew nothing about Wyoming, so I just read John McPhee, you know, about this woman, you know, who gets in a stagecoach and basically takes this, you know, trip out to Wyoming from New York. And just reading that through in kind of an ecological, historical spectrum that then gives you a different way in, versus always relying on this kind of linear aspect of the past, where you're going to go back and find a date and move forward. So trying to find these points, you know, of entry, and they could be, you know, more contemporary or historic, but as long as they get you in there. And then out of that, there's just this kind of wealth of places where you can go once you start there. So research is a very broad term, right? Because sometimes research is just me sketching.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Are people's stories fictional, living, the guy you bump into on the street? Or do people's stories always play a role?
Yes.
Like always?
Yeah.
Like every time?
Always. Because that is how people see the world and how they see themselves, right? And even if you find out that they're fictitious, there's some truths there for some way, right? And so when we do community meetings, people are always saying, I want. And we try to get people out of the I wants and start getting them to say, well, how long have you been living here? What did you, to get them thinking about the place. And before you know it, there is this outpouring of information because most people aren't, how can I say, brought into a conversation about their lives, about the places in which they live versus about what they want and what they.
So the places where people live, literally, someone is asking how you think about, or does the vocabulary, even the actuality of housing come into your work, or if not, how do you feel about in this urban development? You're talking about, for instance, lack of investment versus growth on the other side of the line. This dilemma of how gentrification is both positive and negative versus the old stuff hanging around and maybe deteriorating. And so housing and that general sort of redevelopment, because we could hear you talking about that line story, which could be read in different ways, in different places where what came and replaced the past was investing, caring, putting money in, maybe making the lives of those people in that place better, but what was lost?
Well, I think you have to ask the question, is change better than what we have today? Right? I mean, I've been in this neighborhood 25 years, and it's actually gotten worse, right? Rick Lowe from Project Row House, I invited him out to my studio maybe a decade ago. We were walking around the neighborhood, and someone at the previous meeting was saying, oh, you're being gentrified. He had something really interesting to say. He said, so how long has this area been gentrified? And it's like 30 years. And if it's been 30 years gentrified, that's a generation. I mean, you've gone through a few generations. And so for me, I would rather act than not act, right? And I think, again, it's those who's acting, right? So if I'm waiting for the developer out here to come in, I know how he's going to act. And those of us here, we're afraid to act because we've been told if we act, we're going to lose it. And that's because we don't have a clear idea of where we're going. And that's what I mean about these futures. If we have a strong understanding of where we're going, then we might take a different route to get there. But if we put our pennies into the faith-based, the nonprofits, I know how they work. They need our demographics to keep their pockets going. And so they really don't see a future. So when I ask St. Mary's about what is the future, their future is just, oh, we're doing senior housing. We're just going to have some senior housing. So it's the same thing. And so I think we need that courage to get over a 20th century planning idea that we have to wait for someone else to tell us what the future is going to be. And I think that's been the biggest handicap, I think, in a lot of marginal neighborhoods, is that even with the new leadership, that vision is either something they saw across town somewhere, and it's not somehow part of that local culture that can be inspiring. And that's, Black Power is not to say, these towers, but it's to say we can be inspired by something different. And if you're inspired, maybe you end up in a different place.
So does that mean you have to do community organizing?
No, I don't think it does. I think it means you have to.
You mean you can act as a sole agent and within that community and make change?
Yes.
And you think that?
I'm doing that here.
is
Doing that
accepted?
in my studio. I just bought another space around the corner. And what we're trying to do is do it through showing people that you don't have to leave, right? Here I am, a college professor, I have a business. Most of people, they will leave the neighborhood to go downtown or somewhere else. And we've made a conscious decision that we want to stay here. But what does that look like? I think people don't have a clear idea what that might look like.
So you're making public spaces, buying buildings that others come into, or we're talking about the envelope,
No,
the
private.
outside?
I'm talking private space, right? I mean, because again, if I look and I look at who's moving in and who's doing something, people, they don't look like me. And my point is, if people see that here I am, this Black guy, right, who wants to invest in this place, maybe other Blacks like myself might come into this place, which is not taking someone from Walnut Creek or some alien coming back in. Because what's happening is most people of color like me are moving out into the suburbs because they want to live in a safer place, they want better schools, they want a better quality of life. And so you can't argue with that. And so how do you get that quality here? And that's the thing that we're trying to suggest, is that we can still have this quality of life here, but I just need more people like me, right? Versus being the sole agent.
So your engaging of the community is at present by example.
Yes.
You're designing, they're not designing, but you're hoping it changes the view. And
yeah. Classic example, when we bought the building and I showed all the, graffiti on the building, we painted the building, right? And immediately the guy from across the street, brother, I've seen him for years, he comes and says, you gotta hire a muralist, because if you do a muralist, they won't tag the building. And I said, no, we're not doing murals. We're gonna show that you can actually have a real building with, other things. And he goes, they will tag it, they will tag it, they will tag it. And now that we've had it up for 6 months, no tagging. And people actually, come and look at the art. And so in a way, just trying at, baby steps, right? We're the only block that has trees now, right? And so again, just trying to do these very small things, small gestures. And I'm hoping that the students can bring ideas that can push that a little further out into the public realm and into our space that we open up every Thursday to the community barbecue. So it's a way of.
So you do have a public space.
Yeah, but when we want it, put it that way.
Right, that can flip, the door can be open. So since you bring us back to the class with that comment, and soon we'll have to close, but might you talk about how teaching is part of your creative practice, or maybe you don't, by my assumption?
No, teaching is a very important thing, because to me, you can do a lot with numbers. I like big classes, right? Because I can talk about one thing in a myriad of ways. And I teach this cultural landscape and memory course where I have 100 students and I send them out in the Bay landscape and I say, bring something back. It could be from yesterday, it could be nascent or late, but bring it back and tell us why you're bringing it back. Exhume something that's been forgotten. And you can imagine 100 projects, right? Where students, and some, will go towards their ethnic landscapes, but it's always this amazing broad kind of spectrum. And when you get students to see that kind of diversity, it could be really powerful. Or there are big research projects. The one at Yale was on, looking at futures. Previous to that, I did this post-colonial landscape where I had students look at the entire Bay, going from the Aboriginal all the way through the colonial, all the way through the empirical. And so the imperial, because we actually had the US submarine base here that actually went out and patrolled the Pacific. at the turn of the century. And so you could actually trace this history in one little area and see all of these erasures and these narratives within one space. And so in a way, it helps with research, but it also allows for this larger conversation to happen. And particularly with younger people, I like exposing them to just these different ways of thinking, before they get to the place where it's locked in.
So as a creative practice for you, how does that come back?
It forces me to be dynamic. I have to change. I have to change as part of practice. I mean, I have some colleagues that they still do the same thing from 20 years ago, but if you're engaged in the world, my students are part of that world. And I have literally in the last decade or so, I've seen that change, which means then I have to sort of change my pedagogy. I have to really think about, well, where's the shift, and be more open to that shift as well, because it has an impact on my practice as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're going to see that in a living way next semester. For those of you out there who are interested to join Walter's class with Jacqueline Jakunski and lucky enough to become part of that class, I want to not only thank Walter, but pass on a thank you that came from one participant this evening, who also wanted to thank Jay Hood for the music, the rap that was part of that work that I think when you have your class or another occasion, is definitely a work listening to and watching all the way through in a less bumpy style, but it was a good teaser, and you gave us a thought on that, and it seems to be a fruitful collaboration. So I agree with that and did not want to miss that chance for
And
to know
last
that.
Thing, Jay Hood was the first recipient of the Hood Design Artist Grant. And so in neighborhoods where Hood Design works, we seek out young artists and we give them yearly grants. And so we gave him his first grant to do a music video. And so we've done 3
fantastic.
So far in St. Louis and in Charlotte. And so we're always
So this is something you do annually.
Annually, yes. And then we feature them on our website.
So you might do one in Chicago this year.
Might do one in Chicago.
Have you done your 2022?
We have not done our 2023. So
Yes, 2023. I think we're high on your list in 2023 without even knowing who.
that sounds awesome.
So we'll plant that, and it is completely recorded on this, and now for posterity, we see how that plays out. So yet another perk of being with Walter, and thank you for rejoining us next semester.
Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you, Mary Jane. Your voice seems like so familiar. We look forward to it.
Well, we will expand your universe at SAIC, which already is a pretty big one, and we all look forward to what's coming. So, thank you for this evening, and thank you for those of you who joined us through this Zoom. But the living, walking, talking Walter Hood will literally be here next semester, and we look forward to that. So, thank you again, and to the Visiting Artist Program for all they have put together. Bye.
Good night.